So my brother, the cancer that he had, ends up getting into a Jeep accident, cracks his head open, loses partial vision in his eyes, in ICU for a month, heals from that, goes to college, feeling a pain in his knee. Cancer comes back from that, needs a stronger dose of chemo. Chemo's working for him, but unfortunately, it's also beating up a lot of his healthy cells. He get 105 fever. He ends up with septic shock in the hospital. And when your body's breaking down like that, you see a picture of him. Look at the difference between him on the left and then the top left. You know, you see the real impact and that it makes on the body. His body ends up falling into a coma. He's in a coma for 3 months. We don't know if he's going to wake or have any brain activity. Miracle, after 3 months, he wakes, full cognitive faculties, but his kidneys fail from being in the septic shock for so long. So needs to go on dialysis. We all get tested to see who's the closest match. My father's donates a kidney to him. That's successful. And then 3 of my close friends pass away back to back to back at 22, 23, and 24 years of age. So the reason I share that story is because of what the psychologist said to me. Jim remembers this when we did the podcast together, but she said, Eric, what else happened to you as a child and young adult that impacted your mental health that I need to know about? And I said, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. I'm a 35-year-old guy. I had a chemical imbalance that happened to me at 33. You asked me to tell you about my life. Obviously, I shared a lot more than just this. I was sharing a lot of positive memories too. And she said, well, you know what? Like, even though these things were happening when you were younger, they were building and building and building. So I thought, because my story ended at 24, where she stopped me off there. Well, between 24 and 35, I was running sales departments for the Suns, the Devils, and the Panthers. My brain was fine. Little did I know that what she said was these stressful and traumatic events were building up, making physiological and biological changes to my nervous system. And she made the analogy of having like a front row seat for a muddy wrestling match. And my brother was in the ring and my friends were in their rings, and every move they were making to stay alive, the mud was splattering and hitting me. And that made sense for me because of all the things that I'd been through. But the reason why it made no sense for me, for everyone else in society, is because I thought of, if all it takes is having a front row seat to watch things happen to other people, then whose mental health isn't impacted? If you look at this list that's up here, divorces, job loss, breakup, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, bullying, cyberbullying, sickness of loved ones, loss of loved ones, like, or watching global wars on our phone and you're seeing, bodies being carried off. Like, we didn't have that when we were growing up. All these things combined right now, that's mud that's caking up on everyone. And if that's what mental health is at the source, and these physiological and biological changes that are happening inside of our body, there's not a person whose mental health hasn't been impacted. And yet that's not the narrative that's out there. Back to the narratives of 1 in 5 people are mentally ill. Let's stop the stigma, as if there's a group of people who are stigmatizing another group of people, right? So this mud becomes the stuff that's really hard to discuss. And in it being hard to discuss, I kind of call myself, when I'm open about things this way, or when anyone on our staff goes around and shares what they've been through, that we're like a man or a woman wearing a bunch of mirrors. It might sound like a ridiculous analogy, but this is what we mean. We're walking around and there are a group of people who are like, whew, okay, I've been waiting to talk about this stuff, and I'm glad there's a presenter that's coming and opening up because I want to share what I've been through. And then there's a whole other percentage of any group that we go to that goes, I've been waiting not to talk about these things. And so by us sharing what we've been through instead of what label we have, they're forced to look in the mirror. Because when you hear not even the specifics of my story, you hear things like childhood cancer or organ transplant, sibling or family member in the hospital. These mirror neurons go on in your brain and you go, wait a second, I can't avoid this topic because this has happened to me too. And so what we say at the end is, look, this stuff is building inside of all of us, and that's why we need to address it. We know that there's going to be people who are staunchly like this in the back of the room or in their seats or head to the side, that they don't want to engage in this. But we're doing a disservice if we don't engage them in some way. You're going to see how that builds onto the need for the common language. So okay, if that's the case and this mud is building on all of us, our main takeaway and the concept behind same here, you and I were the same, is that mental health is not for 1 in 5 people with mental illness. It's for 5 in 5 people of us who go through these challenging life events that were listed on that chart that was over there. So our takeaways that we share in these pillar ones, we're done with them, is that's a reason why we put together an alliance of athletes and entertainers all sharing what they've been through, not what label they have, which is what we see on most of these websites. Okay. And that it lives across a continuum. That's what we're going to be learning about today, the continuum that it lives on. And it's not defined by what our labels are, but all these challenging life events that we've lived through. And if we can learn the science of how we are impacted, Happens to the vagus nerve? What happens to the HPA axis? What happens to the brain gut connection? What does it mean to have a leaky gut? We hear that term all the time. Well, then we could start to actually understand how we all move up and down on that continuum and start to do exercise that heal those parts of our body that are impacted. Okay, but how do we get to that place? Because when you ask someone how they're doing and the answer is fine, man, or okay, these are all the reasons why. I always like using a little kid as the example. They freeze up, they give a blank stare, mind is circling with all these things. Feelings are really hard to express. So how do I share them? By the way, I'm saying this about kids. This is teacher to teacher as well, right? Like this is asking another teacher how they're doing. The same exact things happen. There's so many things that I could answer with. What am I allowed to say? Because my parents might not be open to me sharing how I'm doing. If I share and I explain what I'm doing, then I'm going to be put in the category of the sick one. Wait, if I then actually dive even deeper, I'm going to be asking myself all these questions of how am I really doing, as opposed to no, I like to busy myself with band class or with going and playing baseball after school. That's really where my focus is. I'm such a mess. No one else feels this way. I'm the only one who feels like this. And I don't like labels. And probably the one that we hear the most often, why I leave it to the end, I'm a burden to others if I share how I'm doing, right? So what we end up doing in school environments to try to make sense of things is we put people into two different categories. It's the way that we make sense of the world. Who are the good kids that we don't have to worry about, that don't have issues, and who are the bad kids that misbehaved and or have learning disabilities and or have those 504 and IEPs. And so we put them into these two and we go, we got to put our time and attention there. I can't tell you how many times I've been to a school and they've asked us to come in and do what they're doing. Their answer is, well, if we find out more kids are going through more things, we don't have the budget for more therapists. As if those kids aren't going through those things anyway. We don't have to figure out what we do to help them. We only got to worry about the kids that have identified and raised their hands and said there's therapy. So a lot of this is how do we identify and then how do we create peer support systems to be able to help those kids? I didn't go from the smiley kid who played sports to then in bed for 2.5 years and having my brain shocked into these seizures and my face all blown up from the meds that I was on. It didn't happen overnight. But also in it not happening overnight, I had no way to check in to understand that these things were building and that, oh, maybe I should be doing something about it because it's building. So let's take that concept of I didn't know how it was building and let's compare it to everything else that we do in health. When you're sick or you feel like your head is hot, you put a thermometer in your mouth and it gives you readings in a range. 98.6 is normal, 100.1 low grade fever, 103 high grade fever. Imagine you put a thermometer in your mouth and it said nothing but fever or no fever, right? Like that'd be ridiculous. Or you step on a scale shows us a range in weight. We go different times of the year. We go once a year for our physical. We gain 20 pounds or lost 15 pounds. Sometimes we need to go to the gym because we lost too much weight and put muscle on, or we need to lose because we put too much weight on over the year. Okay, there's a range. Imagine a scale just said you're either overweight or regular weight, right? Again, it would be ridiculous. So every aspect of health, temperature and weight we started off with, but your blood pressure, there's a blood pressure cuff, your hormone, blood sugar levels, enzyme levels, you take blood, even inflammation levels. I even at the bottom put cancer cells in there because I could talk about it because my brother had cancer twice. We all have cancerous cells that live in our body. It's whether those cells have reached a certain level because our immune system cannot take care of them that we then have this thing called cancer. But everything in health is a range. And yet somehow we've been told in mental health, it's a topic that you either have and you fit in one of these categories or you don't and you're okay. And the reason I know I could say that people believe they're okay, and Dreza can back me up on this, is when I do my first pillar presentation, after I share my story, I ask 5 kids to stand up, and it scares the crap out of them because I say, I'm going to ask you to share something very personal and private in front of 1,000 of your closest friends in this assembly program. And they freak out. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. Don't worry. Like, you could sit down, you could sit down, you could sit down, you could sit down. Okay, you got to stand up. And I'll use Mike as an example. Mike, you and I, we're part of the 1 in 5 group. Okay, if we're part of the 1 in 5 group, and then I look back at the other friends, if you're not in the mentally ill group and you're in the 4 in 5, what are you? And I get the same 4 answers every time: healthy, fine, normal, and okay. So that's the current understanding and belief out there. There's the kids who have it. And then if not, you're healthy, fine, normal, okay. You don't have it. 1 in 5 in the stop the stigma messaging that keeps us away from this. So what are tools that exist in schools that try to give us some form of common language? Okay, there's diagnostic tools like the Beck Anxiety Inventory. Most folks are familiar with the GAD-7, which is for generalized anxiety disorder, or the PHQ-9, which is for depression. Again, tools that tell us we either have a disorder or we don't. All right, even within a range, let's just say a teacher or a whole school wanted to make up a numeric chart where, okay, there's a 1 to 10, tell us how you're doing. Couple issues with a zero chart when you're asking people how they're doing. The first is, if you're given a middle answer, that's no different than fine, met, or okay. The same thing, that's part of that brick wall. The second issue is, the last thing we want to do is put a quantifiable number on how someone's emotions are in a school setting where they are great on what their grades are. So you're a 0, that's a loser. You're not doing well. I'm obviously speaking in language I'd be speaking to adults about more than kids, but we're unfortunately putting language out there when we're using numerics. They're making people feel worse about themselves or where they're at instead of an understanding of how they're doing. So then you've got tools like this, which is emotion tools and feelings charts. And I have a difficult time reading that, so I can't imagine how a kid reads that, right? And it's like, okay, well, you take one from one area, one from another area, another from another area, but cluster, it's a lot of things together. I can't make out the difference of one of those faces, and this is kind of a blown up picture of it on the left versus another picture that's next to it. They look all very similar to me. So then there was this tool, and by the way, anyone who ends up watching this on the video, and these are tools that you have feedback for me that you use it differently than what I'm describing, please do share. But this is the reason why we thought there was a need for these tools. So, okay, then there was a tool created called Mood Meter. So we're getting into a better place here. There's 4 quadrants you can get into, but how helpful are these 4 quadrants? So let's just say, okay, in the second mood, we've got 2 students who are in the blue category. One student is blue glum, the other student is blue mopey. I don't know the difference between glum and mopey other than maybe they're like Disney characters, right? So you look at that and you say, how is that helping us understand if a student is doing better or doing worse over time? And what does it mean to be in blue versus being in yellow? There's a lot of different terms for each of these. This is probably the most popular one that gets used in schools, zones of regulation. And you look at it and it's like, okay, 4 colors that are stacked up next to each other as opposed to in a grid for 4 different grids. So, okay, maybe this is a little better in terms of linearity, but when you actually start to dive into the actual zones themselves, blue, okay, makes sense. We're starting in not the best place, sad, lonely, tired, exhausted, bored. Okay, then we get to green. Okay, we're going to a better place, happy, calm, okay, content. So that means we should build from there, right? Yellow is now frustrated, worried, overwhelmed. And then red is even worse, angry, terrified. So the problem is, if you see what comes up on the right over here, how do you track the movement in zones of regulation to understand someone moving to a better place or a worse place over time? There's no way to understand accumulation or a cumulative build or a trending over time. So what we started to see, this was actually an instance that became viral during the pandemic, was a teacher who created her own chart for kids to be able to check in on using post-it notes. And this was at least linear. It went from great at the top to pretty much struggling at the bottom. I'm not doing great. And not surprisingly, because the students had to do it right, again, I should say right before the pandemic, it just became popular in the pandemic. They had to put the post-it notes up there. Well, not surprisingly, most of the post-it notes aggregate in the middle because the answer you're going to get is fine, met, at, or okay. And the other issue is students are seeing each other's responses. It's not the safest place to be sharing when you're having to do it publicly in front of each other. So when we started working with schools, we saw a lot of schools saying, well, okay, we just let our teachers come up with their own classification systems, which are very labor intensive. Number one, you have to come up with what your own language is. How does that language differ from one teacher to the next? And then most importantly, when it's the teacher evaluating the student, that means the data is coming from an observational lens instead of coming from the source of where we should be getting the data from themselves, the students and their own type of check-ins. So with all that background, we got together, we've got a board, it's 189 now different mental health professionals, we say from Houston to Hong Kong. And so we got together with graphic design artists, with other mental health professionals, with school counselors. And we said, we got to create something that shows linearity, but that's not numeric, to help people have a chance to check in so that there is common language that's understood by kids as young as preschoolers all the way up to college students and above. And now we use it in corporate offices as well. so that we can get around this idea of two brick walls talking to each other and instead move even one brick away from that wall so we can get the slightest bit of behind what exists behind that wall, because each of us have these huge cities of things that are going on, but we can't possibly get to even one building in that city if we don't move one little brick from that wall and everything stays as fine or okay. I told you I like storytelling. So a case in point of how moving one little brick does a big job of getting us to find out that city behind us. So imagine this is Bill and Sarah. Okay. And they're in their 20s and they live in New York City and downtown and they pass by each other every single day. They think each other's cute, but they never speak to each other because they're both shy. Bill ends up moving to Seattle, ends up meeting someone else. Sarah ends up meeting someone else. They have good lives, but not great life. They could have been each other's soulmate and had this amazing life together, but they were shy. They never spoke to each other. Okay, rewind back to when they were living in the city together. Change, they both got a dog. And now, as they're getting a dog, what is a dog? Common language. When you have a dog, you say, how old is that dog? What's their name? What breed are they? Where'd you get them from? What tricks do they do, right? Common language now creates a relationship that relationship that builds. Bill ends up never moving to Seattle. Sarah then have this great relationship that they develop that point moving forward, have three kids and 8 grandkids from that point moving forward, right? So the commonality of the dog is the common language, is that one move in the brick in the wall that then allows us to find out about the city that exists behind our heads. And if we can do that, we can get populations at schools to get away from thinking of mental health as either this gray cloud that lives above someone, or they're cursed, there's something wrong, or simply a chemical imbalance, and instead understand, okay, there's these changes that happen physiologically and biologically in my nervous system, the architecture of my body, and that makes me move up and down on this mental health continuum over time. I'm speeding through this fast because we lost a lot of time earlier when we got kicked off the video, but that science behind that continuum, some may be familiar with it. It's called polyvagal. And polyvagal shows how our nervous system goes from a place of psychological flexibility to then inflexibility and then eventually shutdown. And so the simplest way to explain this chart is imagine this chart, which has all these words on it, and I think is very difficult to teach to kids. It's why we don't use it, but we use it as the background of the research that was done to create the scale that we use. Is think of this chart almost as traffic light, green, yellow, red. The reason why you're seeing waves between green and yellow is because how we exist as human beings is we go back and forth between green and yellow, green and yellow. Green is parasympathetic response, rest and digest in the moment. Okay, they call it the ventral vagal part in this polyvagal model. So I'm talking to my friend, I'm having a good time, I'm in the moment, smack, something happens, I got to go take care of it. I get a call from mom, something's going on at the house. I snap into my sympathetic response, which is what you see in yellow. Fortunately, why we call it psychological flexibility, after whatever happens at the house, we take care of it, things are under control, we're able to snap back into that green, into more dominant parasympathetic response. So we have to live in this constant wave back and forth between green and yellow, green and yellow, green and yellow. If we were green all the time, when something challenging happened, we wouldn't be able to spring into action. If we were yellow all the time, we would be like too many windows open on a computer at one time, or too many apps open on a phone at one time, or too many plugs in a cord at one time. We would go into the red in the top here and shut down because we would go into a place of overwhelm. So that green, yellow, red is the basis off of which that polyvagal research has been done by Stephen Porges since the mid-90s, that we started to build this concept of a scale. So we moved the polyvagal, instead of layered like that up and down, we did it sideways. And then we started to meet with folks who are graphic designers, getting them to look at people who are in different states of mind. We call them SOMs, or states of mind, to say, what happens to pupil dilation? What happens to the shape of the eyebrows? Can you see their teeth when they're smiling or when they're making a certain gesture? And then in movement left and right, what colors bring out the thoughts related to those movements going left and right? You'll see how this goes into thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Research that's been done through Baylor University over the last 4 years of identifying, as we start to move to a place of dysregulation of our nervous system, what is in that polyvagal chart on the right, and ours is in the top of the polyvagal chart, and ours is to the right. How are our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors changing over time? That there's a legend so that we can look at. So I'll just use myself as an example. When I was a teenager, I was probably living for a good amount of time in the purple, which is fluctuating, just to go back to that. So that fluctuating spot, if you read those, I've experienced a lot of challenges recently. I'm out of sync. I really want to improve. Disinterested, fidgety, confused, unsure, withdrawn, difficulty paying attention, tense, unable to focus, procrastinating and ignoring, distracting yourself, not fully engaged. These are things that I was experiencing, but because I could cram for a test pretty well, because I could get in the game and perform pretty decently on the sports field, I'm not noticing and no one's noticing it in me. But if I had had a chart to be able to understand what are my day-to-day thoughts, feelings, and behaviors like, I'd be able to identify I was in that place. So much like what we were talking about with physical health, where there's a scale that we step on, and based on us going up and down in that range, we then take action. Maybe we go to the gym, we change our lifestyle or our diet. Same type of thing here in terms of the model that we use with Same Here and our other company, 5 and 5 Inc., which is how do we understand how we're moving up and down in a range? And when we move up and down in that range, especially in the long term, what exercises can we start to start to move back to better places to the left within that range? Diving into the nuance of the building of the scale, this is a 3-year process to build it. It looks simplistic, like it's okay, just a bunch of emojis with faces. The first is there's no middle response. So there's 6 places on the scale instead of 5 or 7. So that is someone on the upswing side of fine, Matt, or okay, or are they on the downswing side of that? Okay. Picking between blue and purple. We'll see why those 2 places we get further into the legend are important. Then always showing the continuum underneath, that these places blend and that we're constantly moving. Place all the way on the right, question I get all the time is, why is that not the saddest face? To the polyvagal model, because when our nervous system becomes extended and we become so dysregulated, we go into a place of shutdown. We don't go into a place of sadness or anger. That's the phase before we get to that spot. And that's an important thing for us to notice, because we miss so many kids and students who are in that phase and have gone so far beyond that we're not noticing that there's things wrong because they're not the ones making the ruckus. And then all the words underneath are ing words. Instead of you're the depressed kid, you're the kid with bipolar, you're ing, you're in that place right now. You're sinking. That doesn't mean you're sunk and that you're done and you can't get out of this. So, okay, why were there 3 places in polyvagal, but in our scale, there's 6? We started to understand as we were doing the interviews with Baylor University of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, there's actually more nuance to each one of those places. So when someone is in a dominant parasympathetic response, there's actually 3 phases of. One is more of you're in the zone, which is what yellow is, like you're Steph Curry and you're hitting threes nonstop. Gliding is more, okay, I'm getting over bumps pretty easily, not a problem at all. Blue is I'm starting to notice these bumps more and more, but I'm still able to charge through my day and be pretty productive. When we start to get to the yellow, fluctuating and struggling, there's 2 phases for that. Because now it's okay, as I was reading through what I was dealing with as a teenager, this is really starting to trip up all the way to it's tripped me up so much that I'm at the end of my rope. And if you say another thing to me, I'm going to scream back at you because I'm at the end of my rope. Well, eventually red is that one red phase. I've gone into this sinking phase where I'm so overwhelmed right now. I'm done. I've got nothing to be able to give. So let's take the orange and the red and dive deeper into those. When I was saying we're missing a lot of students, we're missing a lot of teachers in this place, look at the difference between orange and red. Orange is the kids that we actually find out and are able to see that there's something wrong and we do something about it. I'm not doing well at all. I'm overwhelmed. I'm frustrated, on edge, and emotional. Feelings are angry, defensive, irritated, restless, opposite. The behaviors are screaming and crying, using nasty words, hitting, kicking, biting, punching, spitting, throwing, blaming others, demanding and controlling, defiant and non-compliant. These obviously are demonstrative things we're going to notice in kids, so we're going to do something about it. But look at what happens in the phase of our nervous system that's a worse phase over time to the right that we get stuck in. I was so stressed out for a while that now I'm burnt out, 0 energy. Every task feels impossible and pointless, indifferent, melancholic, numb, disoriented, and the behaviors are sullen, lost, and aimless, looking to isolate, delayed reactions, can't complete any tasks, zoned out, frozen, hopeless, and desperate. These are the kids that look at school like, looks like they're taking notes, but they're doodling on their pad. When someone else throws a paper airplane, they don't react that much. So we don't think that they're the problem kids because the behavioral issues aren't there. But they're so in their own head because mom and dad were fighting over a bowl of Cheerios earlier in the morning and they became so overwhelmed, they have nothing more to give. And sometimes those kids are very well adept at being able to cram for the test or do decently on the quiz or answer the question when called upon, that we don't notice them. Okay. So in the short term, it would be expected that we move to the right on the scale. When your great uncle passes away, everyone's grieving in the family. It's expected that you start to get to a place of dysregulation. Your sympathetic response is high. Bigger issue is over the long term. And this is why in the DSM-5 model, if you look at the disorder model, they say 2 weeks or more of these symptoms, it's because neurons that fire together wire together. When we start to get into that place of dysregulation over time, start to get stuck into that pattern of thinking, pattern of feeling, and that even pattern of behaving. So when we break this down for students, when we come into schools, what we say is that green light to the left is that balance, that flexibility of our nervous system between our sympathetic and our parasympathetic response. Over time, what starts to happen is as we move into fluctuating and struggling, now is when our sympathetic response is becoming more dominant. In my case, brother sick, brother sick, brother sick, brother sick. Thoughts about brother being sick. What might happen to him? What happens if I lose him? What happens to other people in my family if they get sick? Till eventually this shutdown, where the nervous system, for me, it didn't happen until I was 33. Fortunately, we see this shutdown happening in kids of all ages. It's why we lose kids as young as 8 years old to suicide, as scary as that is to say out loud. That disassociated place that we get to is because the nervous system is so overwhelmed, and that's where we start to have suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation. When we talk to kids and we explain the difference between parasympathetic and sympathetic response, parasympathetic, we say, imagine you're at your favorite concert and you love the person that's performing, right? So for a lot of kids, it's Taylor Swift or whatever is it that they love. You're so focused in the moment, nothing's bothering you. You're in the flow, you're enjoying the music, present, productive. Sympathetic, stressed, struggling, something just happened, you need to take care of it. That doesn't mean that being sympathetic response is always an awful thing. If you got a cramp for your test, get into your sympathetic response because you only have 2 hours to get as much done as you can. Understanding that there's these two phases of parasympathetic, rest and digest, sympathetic, jump to stress response, what it then allows us to show, oh, when you are in sympathetic for too long, some of the older folks will eventually see this call, will understand what a blue screen is. A lot of the younger kids don't know it because computers have gotten better now. But when there's too many windows open on our computer, or when the sun has been on the phone for too long, or we have too many apps open, it looks like this in our brain. Too many windows open on our brain computer. If we have operating systems on a computer and operating systems in a phone, doesn't make sense that our central nervous system can become overwhelmed and need to shut down just like a phone and a computer do. So back to this model, okay, when I was younger, I was living in more flexible state that when things happen, I could bounce back easy. Then as I started to get into high school, as I mentioned, I started probably dipping into that purple over time, that fluctuating place. People didn't notice it because I'm able to throw passes on the football field, or I'm able to hit shots on the basketball court, or whatever the kid is that you're watching. They're good in the science class, or they're adept at playing in chess club. Doesn't matter what their passion is. You see them being productive in something. We're not noticing this pattern until eventually my shutdown happened. And the case of other kids, we see the shutdown happening. The key that we teach them with the shutdown is, as much as I was in that spot for 2.5 years, what am I doing here right now? My brain's functioning, at least enough right now. People might debate that, but enough right now that I could give a presentation or that I could live a normal life, that being in this phase of shutdown is not a life sentence, which is what we have been learned for so long with mental health. That's the bipolar kid. That's the kid with manic depressive. That's the one with schizophrenia. That's the one with major depressive disorder. And we're not looking at it through the lens of what's going on in the body that's making the genes express themselves in that way. And how do we actually regulate the nervous system back to a better spot so those symptoms aren't as apparent, and so that we can get back to functioning at a higher level. So once we started to develop the scale concept, we started putting it in schools and offices, and we did it in hard copy form like this. And it was just on the walls. And what we started noticing, what we were getting feedback from guidance counselors was, they were asking kids as they were coming in, how are you doing? And you look at guidance counselors' offices and they have stuff all over their walls because they collect whatever they can and it's colorful. And then the kids were looking at the chart because there were choices and they were going, I'm orange face, or I'm fluctuating, and they were reading the word underneath. And so what that led to was the kid was then going back into the classroom, just getting my plug. And in the classroom, the teacher was asking, how are you doing? And the kid was saying, I'm fluctuating. And the teacher's like, where did you get that word from? And then the guidance counselor and the teacher talked to each other and like, well, actually said that to me in my office because that chart was up there. And what we realized was now when you have common language for these check-ins where you understand how someone is moving, and it's not based on them taking the GAD-7 or the PHQ-9 twice a year, but instead being able to do consistent check-ins on a daily or an every other day or a weekly basis, you can stay on top of trending over time. Well, we didn't have money for technology at first, so we put this up on a website. We were like, hey, here's the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors based on the research we did with Baylor. Use this tool however you want. Here's the web page you can go to. And teachers were doing push-ins, school professionals were doing push-ins to teach the language. And then we're marking down, or school professionals marking down, where is someone at? We had the desk charts, almost like little bookmarks. As the teachers went around, the students were pointing at where they were at. And manually, the teachers were taking those down. And eventually it led to this. I won't go through all this because this would be a cluster to explain all this. We do it a whole other session, but like, how do you do trending over time? If you look at that chart that's in the third picture, that's the third picture there. Imagine being able to see for a day, I was in the sinking phase, and this is what was going on in my life. The questions that I answered at that time were related to what was going on that I was struggling with. That was like an event, not I'm the messed up kid. That's what's wrong with me. But my parents were fighting and I got a bad grade and I didn't make the basketball team. Then what mind body sensations was I feeling? I was lightheaded or I had a stomach ache, right? And then what exercises did I do about them? That's what's on the right over there. So that whole concept of, we call it track and act, track in the range where we're at, act, do something about it so we can move to better places on the range. That model's already in place in physical health. It's been in place since gyms became popularized in the 70s and 80s and started going up on every corner. It took Richard Simmons and Jane Fonda normalizing that stuff and sweating to the oldies and all those things to say, well, you actually got to work out. And you're not just a bodybuilder by going to the gym. It's healthy for your body overall. But we're not at that place with mental health where it's like, how do we proactively look at this and go, someone's moving in a trending way that's moving us off to a place of dysregulation over time. So we have, I'll go back to that in a second, which is the QR code. We have these desk charts that we put on desks for kids to be able to point at where they're at. And then we created these whole routines that you can go into the app and create your own routine. There's alerts. In the alerts, there's trending. So you can sort within the alerts and trending by, someone's been answering a certain amount of responses over a certain period of time, an alert comes up. This was all done through feedback with the schools that were our beta partners. Dresik School is one of them that's now starting to get ramped up on that, where we got feedback from them like, hey, there's been tools out there that are web-based tools, but like we're getting way too many alerts and our teachers are annoyed by it. So we built the alerts based on trending over time. We shouldn't be as concerned if we're seeing one marker that a kid is off for a particular day. If they're checking in consistently on that day, trying to get our attention, an alert will come off from that. More importantly is our alerts are based on trends over 2 and 3 week periods, that if we're seeing concerning check-ins over time, then it's alerting the teacher, school professional. And so this whole session, I didn't want to be about the Scale app, Jim, but we built the app in such a way that there's levels. So if, let's say, a teacher wants to have 3 group leaders in her group with her, she's got 2 other TAs. Great. You can have as many group leaders as you want. You want one teacher that's overseeing multiple classes. Fine. A group leader can be a group leader in multiple groups at the same time. If you want levels of those groups, so you want school professionals checking in with teachers, you want principals checking in with school professionals, that's built in there as well. But the main takeaway I wanted everyone to get from this, I'll go back to this and then I'll go to the QR code. So it's up there for folks to be, when they watch the playback, to be able to see it, is right now in the current model that we have, we've got school therapists, school psychologists, we've got school social workers, slightly different roles with each of them. Some of them are talking different languages, but the biggest thing is because of a divide and conquer, there's so many kids that we are helping. And then there's so many other kids that are being left behind. And I would say those so many other kids are 60 or 70% of kids that are not considered in that bad kid category. And the thing is, what is building with them over time? Why do we keep hearing the story all the time when there is a suicide, not them, you never would have thought? It's because there's so many great things that are happening that we're seeing in a productive way, but we're not doing check-ins in a non-diagnostic way to create common language and say, this topic does apply to all of us. It is 5 and 5. It is something that we all can actually use peer to peer. What if I'm checking in with my friend on the playground and I've got the same language as them? That's neuroprotective because now someone is giving me some kind of feedback in terms of how they're doing. A teacher doesn't need to be a therapist. We don't expect them to be, but just the mere check in from a teacher goes such a long way to a student. When I was 16 and was in that fluctuating phase, no one knew what I was going through with my brother. So none of the teachers thought to ask. If I had one way of being able to say, look, today, when I check in on that day, this is where I'm at, how much more that would have opened up dialogue. I didn't necessarily need to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist at that point. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. But just to have that check-in so I knew someone cared about me. And then I was able to see an aggregate representation of where the whole class was without seeing individual responses. That was the key. So I didn't want to go all the way through the hour, Jim. I'm looking at the time right now. But what I hope that does is, and I'll put the QR code up here, is I hope it helps see the need, whether it's our language and our tool or another tool in other languages that you use, that there is thanks, Trez. There, if you bail or checks out, I won't be too mad at you. But understanding that we're leaving a lot where there's not just kids falling through the cracks, meaning like there's a large portion of them because of the binary way we've been taught to look at it, because it's divide and conquer, because we have so few resources. And this tries to bridge the gap on that and say we can have common language and we can have technology. By the way, this is available on Chromebook, ClassLink, and Clever, and all these others. So there's single sign-ons. I'm not a tech guy and I wasn't an entrepreneur. I didn't build this because I want to make money on a tech. I built this because I want to help kids and I want to help teachers and I want to help people in offices that have a way to feel like they're part of a community. And I think that this is what helps them to do that.